World Number 1 Male Tennis Player Rankings is a year-by-year listing of both the male tennis player who, at the end of a full year of play, has generally been considered to be the best overall player for the entire year, and of the runner-up for that year. Rankings before 1973, before the Open era of tennis arrived in 1968, rankings for amateur players were generally compiled only for a full year of play. Professional players were ranked by journalists, promoters, and players' associations usually at the end of the year. Even for amateurs, however, there was no single official overall ranking that encompassed the entire world. Instead, nation rankings were done by the National Tennis Association of each country, and world rankings were the preserve of tennis journalists. It was only with the introduction of computerized rankings in the Open era that rankings were issued more frequently than once yearly. Even the end-of-year amateur rankings issued by official organizations such as the United States Lawn Tennis Association were based on judgments made by men and women and not on mathematical formulas assigning points for wins or losses. In 1938, for instance, when Don Budge won the Amateur Grand Slam, it was easy to conclude that Budge was not only the U.S. number 1 but also the world number 1 amateur player. It was far more difficult, however, to decide who was the best overall player, amateur or professional, for that year because both Ellsworth Vines and Fred Perry, now professionals, were still at the top of their form. Two different sources, however, carefully studied the performances of the players for that year and both concluded that Budge was the best overall player, with Vines a close second. For the previous year, 1937, one of these same sources concluded that all three players, Perry, Vines, and Budge, deserved to be called the co-world number 1 players. In 1946 Bobby Riggs, a professional, had clearly established himself as the best player in the world. In 1947, he was still the best professional player but Jack Kramer had a sensational amateur year. Kramer, having turned professional in November after the Pacific Coast Amateur Chons, met Riggs 3 times in late December on fast indoor courts and Riggs won twice. But at the end of their long series of matches in May 1948, Kramer had led Riggs decisively in head-to-head meetings. It is feasible to argue, therefore, that Riggs and Kramer were possibly the co-world number 1 players for 1947. 1948 was the last year in which an amateur player turned professional and then went on to beat the defending professional champion. Therefore, it is generally acknowledged that the world number 1 in every year since 1948 has been the best professional player. Even here, however, some years present difficulties. Kramer was perhaps the world's best player in 1950 and 1951 when he crushed first Pancho Gonzalez and then Pancho Segura in head-to-head tours but was dominated in tournaments by those same players. In 1952, there was no long, headline tour. Instead, there were short tours between different players and several professional tournaments, with the result that none of the professionals played extensively. The short-lived Professional Lawn Tennis Association published an end-of-the-year list in which Segura was ranked the best player in the world, with Gonzalez second. During the year, however, Gonzalez had defeated Segura 4 matches to 1. Segura had also won a number of important tournaments. So, it is probable that Segura and Gonzalez were co-world number 1 players for the year. The following year, 1953, Kramer narrowly defeated the top amateur-turned-professional, Frank Sedgman, in their tour during the first half of the year and so re-established himself as world number 1, at least for that period. But then, because of injuries, he did not play the second half of the year. As a result, Kramer was now in semi-retirement. In 1954, there were a number of round robins as well as shorter tours, from which it is clear that Gonzalez had now established himself as the best player in the world, the first year in a run of 7 consecutive years as the world number 1. But, given the spotty and often contradictory record-keeping of the professional results since 1926, it is frequently difficult to make a clear, objective judgment as to who was the best player in any number of years. Professional tennis in Europe before 1926, there were numerous teaching professionals, that is, players who gave lessons for money at private clubs and public parks. Because they accepted money in return for their services, they were not allowed to participate in amateur tournaments. They did, however, create a number of relatively small professional tournaments for players like themselves, primarily in Europe. Some of the oldest professional matches known are those between Irish player George Kerr and American Tom Pettit. In 1889, Kerr beat Pettit 3 times in 4 meetings. In June 1890, Kerr won all 3 matches against Pettit in Dublin. In April 1898, a professional, round-robin tournament was played in Paris on covered courts. Both Thomas Burke from Ireland and Kerr defeated Tom Fleming, and Burke defeated Kerr 6-2, 4-6, 6-1, 5-7, 6-4. During the 1900 Paris exhibition, a professional tournament was held on clay, with Burke finishing ahead of both Kerr and the Englishman Charles Hirons. In the spring of 1903 in Nice on clay, Reggie Doherty, the leading amateur, defeated the leading professional, Burke, 1-6, 6-1, 6-0, 6-0. Burke was reportedly as good a player as the leading amateurs, but he is totally forgotten today, as was later Charles Haggett, the best English teaching professional. In 1913, Haggett settled in the United States, invited by the West Side Tennis Club of Forest Hills, New York, and became the coach of the American Davis Cup team. In practice matches, he beat the leading amateurs Tony Wilding, Wimbledon winner, and Maurice McLellan, Wimbledon all-comers winner. In the 1920s, Carol Coe 3/4 Elliott, Albert Burke, and Roman Najuch were probably the most notable, as well as the best, of these players. The Bristol Cup, held at Beaulieu or at Cannes on the French Riviera and won 7 consecutive times by Coe 3/4 Elliott, was the world's only significant pro tennis tournament. Coe 3/4 Elliott went on to become one of the very best of the touring professionals in the 1930s. So, it is easy to imagine that he, Burke, and probably other forgotten teaching professionals were among the top 10 amateur and professional players in any given year before 1928, which is the first year for which any of the sources cited here give a ranking for all the top players of that year. All top 10 rankings for the years before 1928 were for amateurs only. The major professional tournaments before 1968. Tradition on the pro circuit was non-existent before 1968 because the event hierarchy could change each year. Some major tournaments, however, stood out at different times. Elite events that lasted only a few years included, Bristol Cup, 1920s, Queen's Club Pro, 1928, Southport Tournament, 1935–1939, World Pro Championships in Berlin, 1932–1933, U.S. Pro Hartcourt, 1945, Philadelphia, 1950–1952, Tournament of Champions, 1956–1959, Masters Pro Round Robin, 1957–1958, Australian Pro, 1954, 1957 a Euro 1958, Madison Square Garden Pro, 1966, 1967, Wimbledon Pro. 1967, Bonadil Cup, 1930s, Kramer Cup, 1961–1963, 3 major tournaments held a certain tradition and usually had the best of the leading players. They were called championship tournaments. The most prestigious of the 3 was generally the London Indoor Professional Championship. Played between 1934 and 1990 at Wembley Arena in the United Kingdom, the tournament was unofficially and usually considered the World's Championship until 1967. The oldest of the 3 was the United States Professional Championship, played between 1927 and 1999. Between 1954 and 1962 it was played indoors in Cleveland and was called the World Professional Championships. The 3rd major tournament was the French Professional Championship, played between 1934 and 1968, generally at Roland Garros. The British and American Championships continued into the Open era but devolved to the status of minor tournaments. The winner and runner-up in each of these tournaments will be shown for the years in which they were played. These 3 tournaments through 1967 are sometimes referred to as the Professional Grand Slam tournaments by tennis historians. In any particular year, another tournament, such as the Forest Hills Pro or the Masters Pro, could have had a better field. But over the decades, these were the three majors that all professional players sought. Sources of rankings and other information. Other years dating back to 1913 also present difficulties and ambiguities. The rankings below, however, all come from various sources that are as authoritative as can be found. There are 18 sources: the United States Tennis Association Official Encyclopedia of Tennis. This book has annual rankings for the top 10 players as compiled every year from 1914 through 1980. These rankings were made annually by various tennis experts at a London newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, Wallace Myers, John Olive, and Lance Tingay. These rankings, however, included only amateur players. Beginning with the 1920s, some of the best players in the world were professionals. Once they became professionals, as Bill Tilden did in 1931, they were no longer included in these annual lists. History of the Pro Tennis Wars, by Ray Bowers, is a website associated with the Tennis Server website. In 13 chapters, Bowers gives a very detailed account of the first 20 years of the professional tennis tours, from a modest beginning in 1926 with Suzanne Lenglen and Vincent Richards as the main attractions, on through 1945. He also gives detailed results of some of the tournaments played by professionals in addition to the main head-to-head tours. In his summing up for each year since 1928, he gives his rankings for the best players of that year, combining both amateurs and professionals, with the number of players ranked varying from year to year. In all cases prior to 1940, his rankings coincide with those of the Daily Telegraph as far as amateurs are concerned. Total Tennis, The Ultimate Tennis Encyclopedia, by Bard Collins. This massive work has year-by-year chapters in which Collins gives a brief summation of the Pro Tour results, often with personal comments about the players. It also has somewhat more complete rankings from the early years of the Daily Telegraph. The combined amateur-professional rankings for 1968 through 1972 are those of Collins himself. Beginning with 1973, the Association of Tennis Professionals began issuing computer-generated weekly rankings. Collins shows the top 10 players in these rankings for the last week of every calendar year through 2002. The History of Professional Tennis, by Joe Macaulay. This book was published in the United Kingdom and is a year-by-year account of the professional tours and tournaments between 1926 and 1968. The book has 80 pages of year-by-year results for as many tournaments, tours, and head-to-head matches as the author, a long-time writer for World Tennis magazine, could find. The Concise History of Tennis, by Carolee Mazak. This e-book is a year-by-year account of tennis between 1877 and 2009. Each page contains a short summary of the major events in that particular year, and combined year-end rankings in tabulated form that show the performance of the top players at the major events. The greatest novelty of this work is the year-end rankings before 1913. The author has used as many sources as possible, including contemporary magazine classifications and official national rankings. The e-book is available at a website with the same name or can be consulted at the Wimbledon Tennis Library. Professional Lawn Tennis Association. The PLTA was composed of a group of professional players in the late 1940s and early 1950s and, for several years, issued its own official rankings of professional players at the end of each year. The PLTA was also apparently called the Professional Players Association in at least 1946. The Game, My 40 Years in Tennis, by Jack Kramer. Kramer's autobiography has information about the 1954 professional tour that is somewhat different from the other sources but that must be considered authoritative in that Kramer himself was the tour promoter that year. Association of Tennis Professionals. The ATP has issued its own year-end ranking of the top male players every year since 1973. Tennis is My Racket, by Bobby Riggs. Riggs's autobiography has information about the 1946 professional tour that is slightly different from the other sources. He also writes at length about his 1948 tour with Kramer but says nothing about his playing record in 1947, about which there is much conflicting information. The Last Sure Thing, The Life and Times of Bobby Riggs, by Tom Lecomte. This biography published after Riggs' death jives with his own information for 1946 but is at odds with other sources about Riggs's record in 1947. Vancouver's 1946-2003, by Michel Sutter. Apparently based mostly on information drawn from the French sports magazine La Première Coupe, this is an updated edition of his earlier book Vancouver's 1946-1991. Both books list the winners of many professional tournaments and matches for the years shown in their titles, but the earlier book also listed the runner-ups, scores, and the exact dates as well as some commentary, in French and in English, by the author for each year. Histoire-du-tennis.com. This is a French website that has much interesting information, particularly in its extended chapters with a history of tennis. Some of its information about the professional tour in 1954, however, seems to conflict with other sources. The 1954 information may actually be for 1953. Der Grau Paragraph SSTE Meister. Diedinquo 1/4 RDIGE Carrière des Australischen Tennisspielers Kenneth Robert Rosewall, by Robert Geist. This is a detailed account of Ken Rosewall's career with many statistics and, in particular, his annual rankings during his professional career. Anthony Wilding: A Sporting Life, by Len and Shelley Richardson. Royal South Yarra Lawn Tennis Club, 100 Years in Australian Tennis, by Richard Yallop. Modern Tennis, by P. A. Vale. Lawn Tennis, by Mthan Brownlee, Kings of the Court. The Story of Lawn Tennis by E. C. Potter. A very good tennis history book, has many details about the pre-Euro World War I players. 50 Years of Wimbledon. By Wallace Myers. Each year of Wimbledon is examined, although it does not contain top 10 world rankings. However, there are sometimes contradictions between all these sources. Discrepancies in source material. A good example of the occasional lack of authoritative material about the early years of the professional players is the somewhat surprising fact that the very existence of the 1936 and 1938 Wembley tournament is in question. Two sources, Collins and Macaulay, give results for the Wembley tournament in each year. Bowers, however, is adamant that neither took place and offers some evidence to support his view. Another example is 1947. Collins says that Riggs beat Budge in a tour. Macaulay says that there was no long tour, only a short one between Riggs and Frank Kovacs. Tom Lecomte says that there was a small tour with Riggs overcoming Budge 12-6 followed by the short Riggs-Kovacs tour. Other examples are the French Pro until 1933. Macaulay says that the first year of the French Pro is unknown but begins his list in 1930, whereas Ray Bowers doesn't talk about any French Pro before 1934 Garros, September 21 to Euro 23. For example, in 1933, the supposed Hilden Cochet final listed by Macaulay was just, according to Bowers, a singles match of a USA-France meeting at Roland Garros. The world number 1 and 2 rankings. Before 1973 there were no computer rankings, but only journalists or officials or promoters or players themselves who listed their own annual rankings. In 1973 the ATP listed its own rankings every fortnight and some years later every week, but they had many imperfections because in the 70s and the 80s they didn't a Euro unregistered trademark T take into account such events as the Davis Cup, the WCT Finals and the Masters. Nowadays the Tennis Masters Cup give ATP points. Therefore other rankings proposed by tennis experts or by the players themselves could be more accurate because they included these events from 1973 to 2006. This list sometimes differs from the ATP list because it shows journalists' rankings and not computer rankings. In particular, Connors has been ranked number 1, at the end of the year, from 1974 to 1978 by the ATP, but the majority disagreed the computer rankings. For instance, in 1975 all the journalists ranked Arthur Ashe as the number 1 in the world while his ATP ranking was only 4th. In 1977, no one, except the ATP ranking, considered that Connors was the best player in the world, and everyone thought that Borg and Villiers were tennis kings. And in 1978 everyone, and in particular the ITF, recognized that the Swede was the world champion. In 1982 and in 1989 respectively, Connors and Becker, both winners of Wimbledon and the US Open, were considered as world champions even though the ATP ranked respectively McEnroe and Lendl as number 1 and number 2. Since the mid-90s the ATP rankings had been more or less accepted by many as the official rankings. Finally, since 1978 the ITF has designated his world champion. Before 1913 very few sources are available, but Richard Yallop in Royal South Yarra Lawn Tennis Club 100 Years in Australian Tennis stated that Norman Brooks was the champion of the world in 1907 and Lennon Shelley Richardson in Anthony Wilding. A Sporting Life cite the opinions of A. E. Crawley and Anthony Wilding. List, 1877 a Euro 1912. Early tennis era rankings are more variable in nature due to limited sourcing. A equals amateur, P equals professional, 1913 a Euro present, from 1913 sources are more detailed and better documented. Number of times players ranked number 1, note, an undisputed number 1 player for the year is shown in bold, leading number 1 ranked players by decade, 1870s, Spencer Gore, 1877, Frank Haddo, 1878, and John Hartley, 1879, 1880s, William Renshaw, 1881, 1882, 1883, 1884, 1885, 1886, 1890s, Joshua Pim, 1890, 1891, 1893, 1894, 1895, 1900s, Hugh Lawrence, Laurie Doherty, 1902, 1903, 1904, 1905, 1906, 1910s, Anthony Wilding, 1911, 1912, 1913, 1920s, Bill Tilden, 1920, 1921, 1922, 1923, 1924, 1925, 1930s, Ellsworth Vines, 1932, 1935, 1936, 1937 and Fred Perry, 1934, 1935, 1936, 1937, 1940s, Bobby Riggs, 1941, 1943 to 1945, 1946, 1947, 1950s, Pancho Gonzalez, 1952, 1954, 1955, 1956, 1957, 1958, 1959, 1960s, Rod Laver, 1964, 1965, 1966, 1967, 1968, 1969, 1970s, J. Paragraph R. N. Borg, 1977, 1978, 1979, 1980s, John McEnroe, 1981, 1983, 1984 and Ivan Lendl, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1990s, Pete Sampras, 1993, 1994, 1995, 1996, 1997, 1998. 2000s, Roger Federer, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2009, 2010s, Novak Djokovic, 2011, 2012, 2013. External reference, History of the Pro Tennis Wars, by Ray Bowers, Chapter 1, Suzanne Lenglen and the First Pro Tour, Chapter 2, Part 1, The Eminence of Carol Kozella and Vincent Richards 1927–1928, Chapter 2, Part 2, Deja Vu 1929–1930, Chapter 3, Tilden's Year of Triumph in 1931, Chapter 4, Tilden and Nusley in 1932–1933, Chapter 5, The Early Ascendancy of Vines, 1934, Chapter 6, Vines's Second Year, 1935, Chapter 7, Awaiting Perry, 1936, Chapter 8, Perry and Vines, 1937, Chapter 9, Readying for Budge, 1938, Chapter 10, Budge's Great Pro Year, 1939, Chapter 11, America, 1940–1941, Chapter 12, America, 1942, Chapter 13, The High War Years, 1943–1945. See also List of ATP number 1 ranked singles players, world number 1 women tennis players, list of British number 1 men's tennis players, reproducible format, notes.